Hello, and welcome to the U.S. History Underground. I'm Mr. O'Hagan, and as always, I'm joined by the incomparable Mr. Zakari. How are you doing today, Zags?
I'm doing great, Mr. Owen. Thanks for that introduction.
Got it.
I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. We're going to have a special trivia question at the end of the podcast.
Ooh, it's a biggie.
It's a biggie. It's a biggie. We'll take the first 10 correct answers in the comment section, put them into a hat, and pull one lucky listener to win our special prize. Today's also a special day because it's a little bit of a departure from our normal approach to podcasts.
It is, but I think it'll be a great way to talk about some of the complex and multifaceted developments that make up the first half of the 19th century in American history. So, today on the podcast, John Quincy Adams. Okay, Zags, our listeners might be a little confused by our cryptic opening about a different approach.
It is the underground.
Yes, like we were going to talk about global history instead of American history or physics or something.
Well, it's basically safe to say that you and I are not going to be discussing anything about physics on this podcast anytime soon.
As safe as a bar of gold in Fort Knox. So what is the departure? What's the shift in our approach for today?
Well, in class, we generally stay away from teaching history from the perspective of the great man. We always emphasize getting as many perspectives as possible.
Sure, the more perspectives, the more complete the picture. That's what we always say.
But in this case, with the limited time we have for the podcast, using that one set of eyes can be helpful. And our man, John Quincy Adams, is especially helpful because he was such a central figure in the nation from 1800 until his death, really, in 1848, as well as such a powerful advocate and commentator on the two economic models that were starting to divide the nation.
Right. John Quincy Adams was an advocate for the changes we refer to as the market revolution. The economic development and initial industrialization seen extensively in the North and West in this era. But he also was an early and immediate critic of slavery as a moral dilemma that the country was failing to address. In this way, he was a dual threat to Southerners and to plantation owners.
And of course, in the same era, which we're speaking of 1800 to 1848, while these economic systems are evolving, America is experiencing a democratization of politics in the so-called Age of Jackson. And Mr. O'Hagan, I'm going to go deep in the weeds here, but I'm going to try not to. Don't even get me started on the religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening and the subsequent reform movements that follow.
No, I won't get you started.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's restrict our JQA conversation to the market revolution and slavery. Zags, how about some brief context to start us off?
Sure. Well, from 1780 to 1800, you have the end of the American Revolution, the ineffective government under the Articles of Confederation, the Constitutional Convention in Philly in 1787, the ratification of the Constitution, and 12 years of Federalist government under George Washington and John Adams.
Ooh, that is a ton of stuff.
And that's really just the political. Economically, America is trying to find its footing to become more financially stable, but we are still a very colonial economy, very localized economy. Items made by hand, subsistence farming, not a ton of interactive economic activity.
Right. Economists would describe this as a time of limited transactions, where people create for themselves and consume what they make. They don't interact with one another on a large scale.
The Jeffersonian model.
Yes, exactly.
But that economic model is starting to change as this market revolution begins to take hold in the late 1790s into the early 1800s. Eli Whitney is famous for the cotton gin, but just as importantly, he, along with many others, helps popularize the use of interchangeable parts, which he used to produce rifles. But that's a story for another day.
Okay, Zags, but let's be clear. These changes are impacting the North and the West primarily. The South is not only not changing, it's doubling down on its plantation model. So how does our man John Quincy Adams fit into all of this?
Well, Adams had a progressive vision for the nation's economic future. He believed in a strong federal government that played an active role in promoting economic development. This belief was rooted in the idea that a robust economy would lead to national prosperity for all people.
So, a very Hamilton like philosophy.
Exactly. So it should come as no surprise that he supported Henry Clay's American system in the early 1800s, which included a protective tariff to support American manufacturing, a national bank to foster commerce, and internal improvements such as roads and canals. Adams viewed these policies as vital to ensuring the country could compete economically with the European powers.
And serving under James Monroe as Secretary of State, Zags, for 8 years, he promoted federal investment in transportation and communication networks, believing that improved infrastructure would facilitate commerce and connect the regions of the country. When the Erie Canal was being proposed, John Quincy Adams was a supporter, but
Mm.
President Monroe's Jeffersonian leanings meant that federal support wasn't forthcoming, and Adams had to cheer from the sidelines. New York State's DeWitt Clinton took it upon
Yeah.
himself to get the canal started, and it was finished in Adams's own first year in office as president in 1825.
And Adams took notice of the Erie Canal's success. From 1825 to 1828, under his administration, several canal companies, including the Chesapeake and Ohio Company, received direct federal support. Take a look at what Adams is saying in his first annual message to Congress in December of 1825. The Board of Engineers for Internal Improvement have completed the surveys necessary for ascertaining the practicability of a canal from the Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River and are preparing a full report on that subject, which, when completed, will be laid before you. The same observation is to be made with regard to the two other objects of national importance upon which the board have been occupied, namely, the accomplishment of a national road from this city to New Orleans and the practicability of uniting the waters of Lake Memphremagog with the Connecticut River and the improvement of the navigation of said river. When he had the opportunity to support these improvements as president, he didn't shy away.
Adams also understood that the market revolution was not only going to change the economic landscape, but also impact social structures and relationships. He emphasized the need for education and moral development along with economic development. And he supported the establishment of things like public schools and libraries. Zags, he even called for a national university, much like he had seen in Europe.
I mean, Adams was very much a northern man. In his views on economics and technology, think of it as part of that Clay Hamilton 2.0.
Right, right.
And the only negative mark against him is that Adams only served a single term before losing to his arch rival, Andrew Jackson, and that put the brakes on any federally sponsored improvements. So he's a supporter of improvements, but so were many other leaders from his region of the country. What really sets him apart in this era from other Northern leaders was his opposition to slavery.
Right, Zags. Despite the prevailing attitudes of the time, Adams viewed slavery as a moral and political evil. His opposition was deeply rooted in his belief in equality and was the most forward thinking politician of his time in so many ways, especially when it came to the rights for all people, women included. That's
Mm.
probably a nod to his mom, Abigail, who was a formidable woman in her own right.
Don't forget the ladies.
Right, right.
Adams was particularly vocal as a former president as well. After that brutal loss to Andrew Jackson in the election of 1828, he went home to Massachusetts and, at the urging of some political allies, he ran for and was elected to the House of Representatives in 1830. He famously referred to slavery as a blot on the national character and argued that it was incompatible with the principles of democracy and liberty enshrined in the Constitution. But his dedication to this cause often put him at odds with his contemporaries.
Adams served in the House of Representatives from 1831 until his death in 1848. And side note here, Zach, only former president to ever serve in the House.
That's right.
So that's a
That's
pretty
right.
remarkable feature. And this period was marked by his relentless pursuit of anti slavery legislation and other reforms. He was known for his eloquent speeches. He was called Old Man Eloquent by both his admirers and detractors
Mhm.
for those impassioned speeches, but he truly demonstrated his unwavering commitment to justice by standing up against one of the most shameful and cowardly periods in congressional history.
I'm assuming you're talking about the gag order, aren't you, Mr. O?
I am, Zags. I am. Maybe you could fill us in a little bit on this congressional oddity.
Absolutely. So, what the gag rule was, it was a policy that prevented members of Congress from discussing or addressing petitions related to slavery. Adams was having none of it. He viewed this rule as a violation of free speech and a direct affront to the democratic principles of the nation. Bad enough that we were living with the stain of slavery, but he wasn't going to stand by and lose right to condemn this evil system. But his efforts to repeal the gag rule were met with fierce opposition. He routinely received death threats and was shouted down on the House floor whenever he violated the gag order. But he persisted, believing that silence on the matter would only perpetuate the injustices of slavery.
John Quincy Adams directly challenged that order, but he was also pretty cagey. One time he resorted to a parliamentary trick by avoiding the word petition, which was the violation under the gag order, because you couldn't offer any petitions about slavery. So instead, he said he was introducing a prayer that all would enjoy their God given rights. He goes on to say, petition was prayer. It was the cry of the suffering for relief, of the oppressed for mercy. Therefore, to the great shock of Southerners, he asserted that he would therefore not deny the right of petition to a slave. Henry Wise of Virginia, many years later, called him the acutest, the astutest, the archest enemy of Southern slavery that ever existed. A compliment dripping with disdain
Wow.
and respect at the same time. That gag rule eventually would be repealed in 1844.
That's quite the description of him. He fought in the courts too, Mr. O'Hagan. In 1841, Adams famously defended a group of enslaved Africans before the U.S. Supreme Court who had been captured and then revolted at sea, winning control of the schooner Amistad. U.S. authorities seized the ship and imprisoned the Africans, expecting to turn them over to Spanish authorities or keep the Africans as seized goods. But listen what he said here, arguing before the court. The moment you come to the Declaration of Independence, that every man has a right to life and liberty, an inalienable right, this case is decided. I ask nothing more in behalf of these unfortunate men than this declaration.
Wow, talk about calling out the Supreme Court, using the forefathers as the groundwork for it. So, Zags, what did the Supreme Court say in this decision?
Ultimately, the court sided with Africans, and they were eventually given passage back to their homeland, a major victory for Adams and the anti-slavery movement. Here's an excerpt from a letter from the enslaved Africans aboard Amistad thanking Adams for his defense of their rights. Most respected sir, the Mende people give you thanks for all your kindness to them. They will never forget your defense of their rights before the great court at Washington. They feel that they owe to you, in a large measure, their deliverance from the Spaniards and from slavery or death. They will pray for you, Mr. Adams, as long as they live. May God bless and reward you. For the Mende people.
Wow, I mean, quite a letter. Sadly, when John Quincy Adams died in 1848, he actually collapsed on the floor of the house.
That's crazy.
He was living in a nation that was terribly divided, and in no small part due to these competing economic systems. But he offers us a valuable set of eyes through which we can see the conflict of the era.
Hopefully, we have dusted off John Quincy Adams' reputation a bit too. As a one-term president, he gets overlooked. But there is so much for which he should be commended in his one term and in his storied past presidential career. Mr. O, I think you know what it is? I think it's trivia time. Are we ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
Amistad was a 1997 film that dramatized the events we discussed earlier in the podcast. Here's our question, gang. Who directed that film? All right.
I love it.
And it's a very good film, too. Famous actors that students would recognize even 30 years later.
Sure.
I'm thinking
Anthony Hopkins?
Anthony Hopkins and Matthew McConaughey.
That's right.
I don't think this is where all right comes from.
No, it does not.
He's in this one. And we'll have to take a look back. Maybe even Morgan Freeman in this one?
We would have to fact check that, but yes, I mean, it would make sense coming out of Glory a few years prior and historical dramas that were happening during that time.
Remember, we'll take the first 10 correct answers in the comment section, put them in a hat, and pull one lucky member of the Underground Army to win our special prize.
Well, that's all for today. Thanks for joining us. And as always, don't forget to check out all the great videos, content spotlights, A Push on the Road segments, and podcasts on this YouTube channel. We'll see you next time.
Underground Army, dismissed.